When it comes to survival without food or water, the human body has limits, and they vary depending on factors like age, health, and environment. Generally, humans can survive without food for about 1 to 2 months, as long as they have access to water. Andreas Mihavecz is an Austrian man endured an unimaginable experience in 1979 when he was accidentally left in a jail cell for 18 days without food or proper water. Arrested as a witness to a car accident, he was forgotten by authorities in his cell. Remarkably, he survived this ordeal, setting a record for one of the longest periods without food or water. During this time, Andreas experienced severe dehydration, extreme weight loss, and physical weakness. His story highlights the resilience of the human body under extraordinary circumstances, as well as critical importance of neglect in custodial care to prevent such incidents. This is the survival story of Andreas Mihavecz. Andreas Mihavecz was an 18-year-old bricklayer living in Hasch, a small town in western Austria. Known for his hard work and quiet life, Andreas enjoyed his job and spent his free time with friends and family in the peaceful community. However, on April 1st, 1979, his life took a harrowing turn. One evening, Andreas was a passenger in a car driven by a friend. Unfortunately, the car was involved in a minor accident. While Andreas wasn't driving, the police took both him and the driver to the station for questioning. As a witness, Andreas had nothing to hide and fully cooperated. The police decided to detain Andreas temporarily while sorting out details of the incident. He was placed in a holding cell at a station in Bregenz, a nearby city. It seemed like a routine matter, just a brief stay while paperwork and questions were handled. But something went terribly wrong. Andreas, simply an ordinary young man in the wrong place at the wrong time, became the victim of an incredible negligence. What started as a routine arrest for questioning spiraled into one of the most bizarre and harrowing stories of survival, with Andreas left to endure circumstances no one could have imagined. After being brought to the police station in Bregenz, Andreas was placed in a holding cell located in the basement. It was a standard procedure for minor detentions, and Andreas assumed he'd be let out soon. However, a mix-up among the 3 officers on duty led to a critical error. Each officer mistakenly thought one of the others had completed the necessary paperwork and released Andreas. Without double-checking, they all carried on with their regular tasks. This miscommunication might have been resolved quickly, but the location of Andreas' cell made matters worse. Being in the basement, the cell was isolated from the busier areas of the station, where officers came and went. Andreas' calls for help, at first firm and persistent, went unnoticed. As hours turned into days, his cries became more desperate. He shouted, banged on the walls, and tried anything he could to get someone's attention. But the thick walls of the basement muffled his voice, and no one thought to check the cell. At first, Andreas was confused and frustrated, assuming there had been a delay or mistake. But as time passed, frustration turned to fear. Alone, with no food or water, Andreas struggled to understand how something like this could happen. All he could do was keep trying to make himself heard, hoping someone would realize the mistake. Meanwhile, the station operated as usual, with no one realizing Andreas was still locked in the basement cell. Days passed without checking, leaving Andreas to face an unimaginable test of endurance. This ordinary young man, caught in a moment of confusion, found himself completely at the mercy of circumstances beyond his control. For the first couple of days in the basement cell, Andreas managed to endure. Though hungry and uncomfortable, his body still had reserves of energy to draw on, and he assumed someone would come for him soon. But as the hours turned into days, the effects of his confinement began to take a toll. By the 3rd day, Andreas started to feel the severe effects of dehydration. While the human body can survive for weeks without food, water is far more critical. Most people can only last 3 to 7 days without it, depending on factors like temperature and physical condition. Water is essential for regulating body temperature, delivering nutrients to cells, and flushing out toxins. Without it, organs like the kidneys and liver start to fail. Andreas grew desperate as his mouth became parched, and he developed headaches and dizziness, all classic symptoms of dehydration. Searching for any source of relief, he noticed small amounts of condensation forming on the walls of the cell. Basement walls often develop condensation due to the temperature difference between the cool walls and the warmer, more humid air in the room. Andreas began licking the damp surfaces, using this as his only source of hydration. While it provided some temporary relief, the tiny amounts of moisture were far from enough to sustain him. As the days stretched on, the lack of proper hydration and food began to shut down Andreas' body. He likely experienced extreme fatigue, confusion, and even hallucinations, as his brain and other organs were deprived of essential nutrients and water. Beyond the physical toll, the mental effects of isolation worsened his ordeal. Studies show that even a few days of complete isolation in a small space can lead to anxiety, paranoia, and a sense of hopelessness. Combined with hunger and dehydration, these psychological effects would have intensified, making time feel endless and his fear even more acute. Without any idea of when or if he would be rescued, Andreas endured both physical and mental agony of his confinement in unimaginable conditions. As the days passed, Andreas' family grew increasingly concerned. He had never disappeared without notice before, and his absence was alarming. His mother, desperate for answers, reported him missing to the police. Unfortunately, her pleas were dismissed, with officers suggesting he had likely gone off on his own. Meanwhile, Andreas remained trapped in the basement cell, isolated and forgotten. By this point, Andreas had been locked up for nearly 2 weeks, relying solely on the condensation from the walls for hydration. His body grew weaker by the day. Without sufficient water, his organs were on the verge of failure. The lack of nutrients and hydration caused his metabolism to slow to a crawl, his muscles to atrophy, and his mental state to deteriorate further. Another issue began to develop in the basement, an increasingly foul odor. Prolonged confinement in a small, poorly ventilated space causes waste, sweat, and the breakdown of body tissues to create a strong and unpleasant smell. This was made worse by the cool, damp environment of the basement, which promoted the growth of bacteria and mildew, amplifying the stench. 18 days after Andreas was first locked up, an officer who was not part of the original group went down to the basement for an unrelated task. Immediately, he noticed the overwhelming smell and began investigating. To his shock, he discovered Andreas in the cell, severely malnourished, barely conscious, and clinging to life. Andreas was close to death, his body so frail it was clear he couldn't have lasted much longer. The officer quickly alerted his colleagues, setting in motion the events that would finally end Andreas' ordeal. After being rescued, Andreas was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. His body had endured 18 days without proper food or water, leaving him severely malnourished and dangerously weak. He had lost 24 kilograms or 53 pounds during his time in the basement cell, nearly a third of his body weight. It took several weeks of medical care, including a careful reintroduction of food, water, and essential nutrients, for Andreas to regain his strength. Meanwhile, the incident sparked widespread outrage, leading to a criminal trial against the 3 police officers responsible for leaving Andreas in the cell. In court, each officer blamed the others, claiming they believed the paperwork for his release had been completed. The trial revealed a series of miscommunications that led to the oversight but failed to determine exactly who was at fault. Ultimately, the court found no evidence of criminal neglect. The officers were each fined 2,000 euros for their roles in the incident, but no further action was taken against them. As part of the legal resolution, Andreas was awarded 18,000 euros in compensation for his ordeal. Despite the trauma and physical toll, he eventually made a full recovery and returned to his life. Andreas' story later gained international attention when he was included in the Guinness Book of World Records for surviving the longest documented period without food or proper water under such circumstances. Andreas Mihavecz's survival is a remarkable testament to the resilience of the human body and mind. His ability to endure 18 days without food or proper water shows how the human body can adapt and push its limits under extreme conditions. Equally, his determination to stay alive, even licking condensation from the walls, reflect the innate drive for survival that humans possess. Andreas' ordeal reminds us of the incredible length the mind and body will go to when faced with adversity. His story is not just one of endurance, but also a reminder of the strength within all of us.